Hi there. This is Steve Vaccaro. We're getting ready for our monthly club meeting here at New York Cycle Club, and I am not only the MC, but I'm also the entertainment. I see that a lot of people are joining or in the process of joining. I'm going to let that continue, but I'm going to start, I guess, with a few program notes. You will see that Zoom has some functionality with this webinar format that we're using. It allows you to pose a question using the Q&A feature. So all you need to do is run your cursor along the bottom of the screen. I'm not sure how to do it by phone. Maybe wave your finger around the phone screen. Perhaps that will work. Type on Q&A and you can pose a question. And I can see them, and we're going to have questions and answers at the end. There is a poll feature where you can add questions. I'm going to add a question. Okay. I saved the question. You can see it, and everyone can respond to it. Save. Answer 1 is yes. Answer 2 is no. Then, so answer those questions. I'm going to also, okay, launch polling. There is a chat feature if you want to say anything to me or to someone else privately who's in there. You can see who's there. We're going to have a few words from Peter Story, the president of our club, before we begin. Peter is going to mention the passing of someone who is well known to many of us, who donated a lot of volunteer time to the club and was really a good guy, Mike Weitzman. And after Peter finishes up with any sort of club business and some words about Mike, I have a few more notes about sponsorship issues, and then we'll get into the program. So I'll give it to Peter at this point, assuming I set it up right, and Peter can speak.
I think you have. Can you hear me?
I can.
All right. My name is Peter Story. I'm privileged to be the president of the club. As many of you know, our dear friend and fellow club member, Mike Weitzman, passed away suddenly and unexpectedly at the end of July. It's been said that a club is its people, and some of them more than others. And Mike Weitzman definitely belonged in the first category. He made his way from the C-Sig, where he met his wife Felicia, through to the ranks of A-Riders, making friends at every turn. He was an A-Sig leader, a mentor, a hardworking member of the club's board, and for 2 years he was director of our Escape New York event. But whether he was taking the SIG, leading the SIG, running ENY, keeping the board from bogging down on some little administrative detail, Mike was one to look up to, both physically and figuratively. He was warm to everyone, even on the first meeting. His eyes actually twinkled. His smile welcomed. He was agreeable without being squishy. He was patient without being a pushover. He was a true gentleman, and we are richer for having known him and poorer for his passing. And I would ask you to keep him in your thoughts. Thank you. If there's any other club business, put it up through the Q&A and we'll deal with it later on.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'm just going to mention that There's a company called Science and Sports that specializes in products, nutritional products for cycling and other active sports. It is an organization that had stepped up and was going to sponsor the Escape New York, which is not going forward this year. Sorry, I'm just gonna. That was funny. That was a census taker who came to my door to have me fill out the census. So let me add to the announcements that I make that everyone should complete their census responses. Science and Society should be recognized as a sponsor of tonight's program after some discussion, because there's no Escape New York for Science and Society to sponsor. I'll also just, so take a look. You're going to find a link on the page to this event that will give you more information about the products that they provide, and they are a valued partner for the Bicycle Club. Another valued partner, and happily so, is our law firm of Vaccaro and White. I'm a principal in that law firm. We are also a sponsor of Escape New York. We paid our sponsorship funds before the pandemic hit, and we were happy to leave them with the club, and they will form, they will be funds available to the club to distribute in support of various cycling activities. Historically, the club has donated the major portion, if not all, of the proceeds of Escape New York to supporting cycling education and cycling efforts by the Kids Ride Club. And I promise myself and other organizations that promote cycling amongst inner city youth, Black and brown kids who might not have a chance to bicycle anyway, we're happy to have the funds used again for that purpose, even if there's no ride. There will be a raffle, however, and what we've arranged, many of you know club member Damon Strub. What we've arranged is that some of the money that our firm has donated will go towards a custom bike build, or two of them, by Damon. So participate in the raffle, buy the tickets, and you may win a voucher, in essence, worth $750 towards work done by Damon. And he tells me he can put together a pretty good urban bike for you for that amount. And certainly if you want to add some funds of your own, you can get a really good one. And so we're excited about that, and we hope you'll participate in the raffle in order to get those and other prizes to be announced, because it'll just help us raise more money to support those cycling charities that the club traditionally has devoted its Escape New York proceeds to. I'm now going to go to a PowerPoint presentation that I made for tonight. Okay. So go here, share screen. Here's the presentation. And, almost. Okay, we wanted to go from the beginning. Cycling in the age of COVID, today's date, we're there. What am I going to cover? As advertised, the urban bike boom of 2020. Some topics that fall under the rubric of how perfect biking is for this time, this pandemic times, both as a pastime and as transportation. How much better it could be for us if government hadn't dropped the ball and the opportunity still available for making biking and other types of activity other than driving a better, more enjoyable, more widespread and safer in these times where we're concerned about virus transmission risk. And then just some practical tips about biking that will very quickly cover things that I've covered in past talks that are known to most members of the club who are on the call. What is the source of the 2020 bike boom? Well, it's there as an alternative to mass transit for those of us concerned about getting the virus on the subway or buses. I put out a poll at the beginning because I wanted to see what people, and people by and large said that they have used a bike more often since the virus hit than they would have used a different mode before. And I was trying to capture who's shifted trips from subways or buses onto bikes. And of course, the thing about that poll is that many of the people who are watching now and voting on that poll would have used a bike for just about everything. So there was no room for modal shift in their daily habits. So that may be misleading, but the poll shows that that clearly a significant number, 60 to 40 approximately, have shifted some trips over from mass transit. Back to screen sharing. You're not allowed to shift back and forth easily in this program. And then obviously, we're all looking for recreation. During the lockdown, bicycling is outdoor recreation that's free for the most part, so it's a wonderful option. It's been a significant element in Black Lives Matter protests, as Brent Barber said at our last club meeting when he talked about these demonstrations of thousands of cyclists who've seen that it is a great way to basically be able to cover more ground, get your message out to more people. As we all know, cycling is, unless done at an athletic pace, far less arduous than walking, especially if you're carrying stuff with you. And you can easily just put a sign on your bike and go around and be part of a protest or spread a message if that's what you care to do. And it's really a lot easier, and it's much more attention grabbing, frankly, than walking around with your message. The bike boom is measurable. The East River crossings that were measured by the city, they didn't do the full screen line count this year, but they see a 20% increase on bridges like the Queensboro and the Brooklyn Bridge, which I didn't even think had enough room for added capacity at rush hour, but they're showing more, as well as the other East River crossings. Anecdotally, I see an increase of 2 to 3 times on the Hudson River bike path, which is my commute. You know, there is clearly, as we all know, a shortage of new bikes for purchase. There are long waits for repairs at bike shops. An organization I sit on the board of, Bike New York, runs Recycle a Bicycle. Recycle a Bicycle is liquidating an enormous inventory of bicycles that they had warehoused, that they received as donations. They're selling them primarily on eBay, but also in their shops. Their biggest problem is finding qualified mechanics who aren't otherwise occupied to fix up those bikes. There's an enormous demand for bikes, and you will find a wait of 3 to 6 weeks at bike shops for repairs. You know, anything more than just a quickie. And buying a new bike, very little selection available. There's also reported a big increase in bike theft. Another sign that people are looking for bikes, so be careful, lock carefully, try to cross lock if you can, with both a cable and a U-lock if you're going to park outdoors, and especially overnight. There's been a spike in bike stocks. I was very interested to see this. Look at this. I mean, a number of us made a little bit of money by timing the COVID stock market crash and then bounced back up. But if you had invested in Merida, you would have had the stock price go from somewhere around $50 at the bottom of the trough to almost tripling, up near $140 a share. Nice return. Wish that I had jumped in on some of those bike stocks, and Giant and Shimano not far behind, showing increases of, I guess, Shimano actually didn't really double, but it only went up by 50%. But something to bear in mind the next time pandemic hits town. So the financial analyst and the article from the Financial Times that I looked at, I thought really summed it up nicely when they were talking about those stock increases. You know, that the people who are bidding up those stocks believe bikes will replace journeys on crowded public transport, emerge as the ideal socially distanced fitness regime, and propel a green reimagining of urban layouts. And I think that that, in a nutshell, is a lot of what I'm going to try to cover in this presentation. So we, as mentioned, you know, we have this need for recreation. I was stuck indoors for over 4 weeks, closer to 6, with presumptive COVID. It turned out it wasn't COVID, or at least that's not what they think, but it was an absolutely terrible hit. And anyone on this call or who knows someone who was stuck indoors that way, and we were all pretty much stuck indoors trying to stay clear of the virus, you know, it makes those opportunities to go out and ride a bike that much sweeter. It's really almost a desperate need to get out. And here are these other options that people ordinarily, without the virus, would use that are closed. Any kind of indoor activity studio, also outdoor, even pools, many of them are closed. People who like to play team sports in a league are also facing proximity and transmission issues to the extent they're dealing with contact sports. Less traffic, we found, also created more space for cycling, although it also created more space for the motorist left, meaning more speeding, and there has been an uptick in collisions. Even though there's less traffic, there's more people getting hurt and killed now. And we also find that people are running, operating electric and other types of scooters in our bicycling space that we expect to have, both on the street next to the parking lane where we're used to riding, as well as, of course, on dedicated paths and in the parks. We now find that there's dining going on in spaces that we might have used for cycling before. So it is a mixed bag in terms of creating more space for cycling, but it's an opportunity, which I'll speak about more later. I'm going to present in some subsequent slides the evidence that I think proves, at least to me, biking poses little, if any, transmission risk because of these factors that scientists who look at this consider most important: distance, ventilation, and dose, in terms of the ability for airborne respiratory droplets of whatever size, whether the big ones, the small ones, whether they can actually carry enough viral particles to be a sufficient dose that the recipient of that dose is going to have their natural resistance, immunity, defense mechanisms to the dose of viral particles overcome, and is going to actually become infected with the virus. You know, so there's natural social distancing with bikes. You know, the wind turbulence interacts to prevent transmission of a sufficiently high dose between cyclists. This is true when riding single file. A bicycle is going to keep you basically 6 feet from the face of someone who's in a line behind you. My bike is 6 feet long. Other people have smaller frames, but you know, there's going to be some distance between wheels. So we're talking automatically about approximately 6 feet between people who are riding single file. When you're riding abreast, even those who are concerned about this type of transmission situation, and it's very, very few, you know, at least among scientific investigators, even they will say, look, if you're side by side, the wind is just going to blow the particles behind you, so it's not an issue at all. When there's opportunities for riding in a car-free environment and you can ride abreast of each other, it's just a non-issue. The reported guidance has consistently said that there is not, you know, that outdoor exercise with proper social distancing doesn't prevent a significant transmission risk. So I grabbed first an article that was put out March 27th, just when the lockdown order was put in, and people were asking these questions: can I jog during the pandemic? And here from the article, you see, as long as you're 6 feet away, you can exercise outside. I don't think that that guidance really has changed from any government authority I've heard of. And here's a little bit more detail, a specific question. If I'm running 6 feet behind someone and they cough, will I jog right through their germs? You know, it's conceivable that droplets will linger long enough for you running behind that person to breathe them in, but you know, the wind would more likely disperse those germs first. You know, if it doesn't, okay, it could happen. And this was an early discussion of this by a Dr. Iwasaki, who was interviewed for the New York Times. It's unlikely, but not impossible. That's a pretty low risk. Here's another article that came out May 15th and was updated July 3rd. What we know about your chances of catching the virus outdoors. Lindsay Marr, engineering professor and aerosol scientist at Virginia Tech. Outdoors so much better than indoors. As long as you're 6 feet apart, the risk is very low. There's so much dilution happening outdoors, and that was addressed in another quote that disappeared. Okay, it had to do, in that same article, there's a discussion that you have to get a sufficient dose of the virus in order to become infected. As I mentioned earlier, you cannot get infected from one viral particle. Your body will easily destroy that particle. There have to be hundreds or thousands of viral particles that you inhale in order for you, or somehow otherwise ingest into your respiratory tract to become infected. And that, you know, the wind is going to disperse those particles so that you're not going to get a dose like that outdoors, except under very unusual conditions, or if you're stationary, two people, you know, lying on the beach sunbathing together, or maybe you're eating outdoors, but you're at a table. There was this wind tunnel effect that was hypothesized in one article early on. It suggested that if you are riding behind someone else who's cycling or running, you have to have much more than 6 feet, up to 35 feet. If you want to stay safe from being exposed, and I think that the discussion that followed has pretty much debunked the suggestion of that article. And there's the article there, that's the heading if you want to find it. I also linked it in a comment that I posted on the NYCC discussion board. The study, typos excused, used data about the characteristics of droplets from previous studies. There was no research and no attempt to model the durability of C19 droplets. People who've talked about this article have pointed out that the larger the droplet, the better the host it is for the viral particles surviving for any significant period of time in the air, because the droplet in essence is a protective medium for the viral particles, keeping them active. The smaller the droplet, the less protection there is. The more the droplet begins to evaporate in the air and therefore cannot be a host to keeping the viral particle alive, the more the ultraviolet rays of the sun in an outdoor setting would play some role in killing some of the viral particles. And so the thing to bear in mind is that it's the smaller particles that have any kind of aerodynamic persistence in the air. So the droplets that are going to possibly hit the bicyclist behind you are the ones that are least likely to have many viral particles, and many viral particles that are still alive and could serve to transmit the virus. It's only much larger particles, which fall to ground much more quickly, that tend to be the ones that cause infections. That was the point I just covered. The study did not look at the role of exterior wind, which we know there's always some wind going on, and it's going to blow, you know, these particles that the rider in front supposedly is transmitting, you know, in a laser-like fashion via slipstream to the riders behind them. So that was another factor that's present in the real world, not present in the study. And basically this was its conclusion, is that in a laboratory controlled environment, in a wind tunnel, you can have micro droplets travel up to 35 feet. And, you know, I would submit that it's not a real world modeling of what exposure risk is like. But it came out early, and it made an impression on a lot of people. It filtered out and was covered in a lot of media reports. But I just don't think it reflects what's going on in the real world. And if you look at the empirical evidence and the studies that are out there, I found a Japanese study. It was useful. It looked like pretty well done, although it was just an abstract. These things are very new. There hasn't been time for peer review of any of this literature, these investigations. But in the Japanese study, the vast majority of exposures are occurring indoors. So you have a much lower risk of exposure. And you think about how one does not get, the virus automatically just from being exposed to someone, even indoors. And then you have 1/20th the risk if you're exposed to someone outdoors. And that's not even looking at the idea of exercise. That's just being outdoors, maybe two people lying on a beach blanket together. There is a Chinese study, obviously much longer. We have our skepticism radar maybe a little bit higher on Chinese studies. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it's much bigger. And they found only 2 cases of outdoor transmission. They were both stationary in a much larger study. And there is only 1 case that I have found anywhere reported that 2 people who were engaged in active outdoor activity actually transmitted the virus to each other. 2 jogging partners in Italy. Who knows what else they were doing. We often say, as lawyers, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Just because there isn't proof that this has ever happened doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It just means that the evidence is not all in, perhaps. But I would submit that the reason there's no hard data is because the incidence of transmission is so rare that it's just like finding a unicorn to find cyclists who have transmitted this to each other. And I think it should give people confidence, and I would encourage them to consider group bicycling activities, certainly solo bicycling activities, as really the best way to get through the pandemic and maintain your fitness, which of course is one of the things that will keep you safe from COVID. The enhanced cardiovascular health that you get from vigorous exercise like cycling is going to protect you from having the underlying conditions that we know can make COVID fatal. Think about how we cyclists assess the risk of other types of negative events, like getting hit by a motorist or falling from the bike. And you consider that we take much, much bigger risks all the time when we go out bicycling, especially if we're pace lining, than the risk that I think is demonstrated by either scientific proof or even scientific principles when you look at what evidence is available in terms of virus transmission risk. Here's one more piece of evidence I just wanted to show you. Here's the curve in New York City. We're of course all very glad that we have been able to flatten that curve out. It's not due to herd immunity, that phenomenon, because there aren't that many people who've been exposed and who test positive for antibodies. I think it's been a reflection of the fact that we have learned what does and doesn't transmit the virus. And by and large, we are following the public health guidance. And consider the fact that right in the last week of May is when George Floyd was killed by police. And between then and June 1st, we had a massive outpouring of demonstrations, and people left their homes that they had been secluded in and isolated in to avoid viral infection, and they went out into demonstrations that were largely by foot, but also, as we saw, including demonstrations with 10,000 or more cyclists riding together. There was no bump in the number of cases in New York City. You can't see it. It didn't happen. And that's because people were wearing masks, but I think even more importantly, because they were outdoors. And I think that it is very rare for this virus to be transmitted outdoors. There is a big missed opportunity we had here with the virus to reshape our streets into the greener, I can't remember the exact words of the Financial Times, the greener urban utopia that we all where many of us long for. We saw an increased reliance on delivery cyclists to show how much commercial travel can be handled by bikes and smaller vehicles. We saw that people, with the decrease in traffic, we saw that there's a lot of unnecessary private motor vehicle traffic out there, that people can get by and people can do things like work at home and not just cruise around in circles in their cars. The exodus of residents left many of the parking lanes empty, and the need for social distancing made transit options less desirable, active transportation more desirable. The space pollution of private motor vehicles became more evident. If someone wants to keep themselves safe from the virus, if their idea of it is driving around in an SUV, they're taking up just all of the space, and we have less of it now. We think about how closely we pass each other on the sidewalk. We think about people coming off the sidewalk who are joggers because they want to get away from the walkers, and now all of a sudden they're in the biking space. There is an incredible competition for the space, and so using a private motor vehicle to get around in the city, I think, starts to be seen as a kind of space pollution or inefficient use of the space, when there are other things like biking, jogging, walking, dining that can be done in our public space, our biggest piece of public space, which is the public roadways, that's more efficient. And these slides came out. You have to apologize because I had to do this a bit last minute, but these are some points that I earlier made up at the top. Cities around the world have taken the opportunity to dramatically expand network of bike lanes, not to mention outdoor dining. London, to rapidly expand space for cycling and walking post-lockdown. Not just the mayor, Sadiq Khan, who's very progressive and announcing that we're going to rapidly expand the infrastructure, but also Boris Johnson, who, remember, is really quite conservative, almost in the cast of our current president in the United States, some would say, but has always actually been a proponent of cycling, which has kind of fascinated me. I think bicycling does not necessarily cleave along traditional left and right distinctions. And Boris Johnson is an example of someone who no one would consider a liberal or left-wing person, who has been tremendously supportive of cycling, brought bike share to London, brought congestion pricing to London. And here he is talking about how they're expecting a 10-fold increase in bike traffic and a 5-fold increase in pedestrian numbers. It'll be a new golden age of cycling. Meanwhile, what's going on in New York? Our mayor has been very slow and reactive and resistant to repurposing street space throughout this. And I have been one of the people, I have to say, one of the louder voices using the means available to me, which were social media and organizations through which I'm active, such as Transportation Alternatives and Streets PAC and otherwise, to try to get the message through that New York should be repurposing space. And what this culminated in was an open streets debacle in April, where the Livable Streets community, which is composed of many cyclists, but not exclusively of cyclists, was saying, if people need to get out of their homes, we don't want to be prisoners. We have all this public space in front of our homes in the form of the roadways. So why not shut down the roadways and allow people to get out and be socially distant? And the view of the mayor was that people can't be trusted. People are just going to congregate. And it was basically I think a police type view of anytime you have people in the streets, it's like it's a big mass event and people aren't going to be responsible. So really leaving them open to motor vehicles, even motor vehicles speeding and hurting and killing people at a higher rate than they were before the pandemic, well, that's the best solution to preventing people from congregating in the streets. It's actually a crowd control measure. Make the streets more dangerous and deadly, or let them be so. And that was not an explicit rationale articulated by the mayor, but he had these open streets that were heavily staffed with NYPD officers in April that were isolated blocks. They were totally uninviting. They were basically like a street fair, but with no programming, and they were all located, and all the cops, and they were located next to parks, which were already still available to people to use. So no one used them. And then the mayor declared it a failure. And in fact, this whole plan was something that the mayor announced because the Livable Streets community had organized the city council to introduce legislation. And it was just after the legislation was introduced to create 75 miles of open streets that the mayor panicked that this aspect of COVID management would be taken away from him in his moment to show how in control and on top of everything he was. So he instantly that day announced that in his plan, oh, I have 100 miles of open streets. So we don't need that legislation, City Council, and the legislation didn't go anywhere, and we were left with the mayor's plan. Very few bike lanes have been added. We're starting to see an increase of that, but we see that they're actually painting out a bike lane on Lower Broadway, which happens to be near where I work. I guess it runs from City Hall South to all the way to the Bull at Bowling Green. There's one that has been completely useless that consists of a bunch of barrels that have been moved out of the street and onto the sidewalk on Crescent Street for those who live in Queens, which is an important approach to the Queensboro Bridge. The process of instituting bike lanes has been somewhat streamlined in the sense that there's no longer an exhaustive opportunity for people from the neighborhood to come in and say, we've done enough for bikes, get rid of the bike lanes, we hate cyclists. That was always something that slowed down the implementation of bike lanes. But, you know, frankly, they're not being implemented any faster, even though that part of the process has been removed. We also pushed very hard to get the streets open to restaurants in April. And it was something that the mayor just wouldn't do. He was afraid of the pandemic risk. And I think in retrospect, when we see how few of these transmissions occur out of doors, that was a mistake. Now, maybe this understanding is something we've only gained in the last month or two and wasn't available to us in April. Better safe than sorry. Okay. And I guess the mayor is acting consistent with that now and saying that open streets for restaurants is a success, and we're streamlining the process of allowing restaurants to basically spill out into the street. They no longer have to have those same community boards approve their sidewalk cafes, which has always been a heavy lift. And that the outside and in the roadway dining is going to continue through the next year. This was something that the mayor had to be almost bludgeoned with politically before he was willing to even try. His focus has been on alternate side of the street parking, and anyone who has a car probably knows. He's been talking about it constantly, and it just shows that even though he, in my view, was the best of the mayoral candidates back at the time when he was first running, and I supported him, and other forces within Livable Streets did support him, such as Streets PAC, because he propounded Vision Zero and was in favor of reducing traffic deaths and promoting walking and cycling. He's really turned into someone who's just not a friend on our issues, and that has spilled over into the policing and traffic enforcement area, where police are giving out far fewer tickets. And the streets are far more dangerous and deadly due to traffic collisions. Part of that is the fact that with less traffic comes more speeding, but I'm sure that most of the people on this call have recognized that a much more aggressive brand of driving has returned to our streets that I think very gradually had left in the years, certainly since the speed limit was reduced down to 25. Back about, at this point, it's probably 7 years ago that happened, because police just aren't enforcing the rules. There are traffic cameras, and thank goodness we have a speed camera program, again, primarily the work of our Safe Streets community. but police have stepped back from traffic law enforcement. First, there was a blue flu during the COVID peak period. I don't really know what the test results were. The claim was that it was reported back at the time in April that about 1 in 6 officers were out with quote unquote flu-like symptoms. Now what's being reported is that, you know, those 1 in 6 officers all had COVID. And honestly, I don't know if I trust the police statistics enough to know that it's really an accurate summary of how many police officers had the virus and therefore were disabled from doing their jobs during the peak period. Certainly, since the end of May, we've seen police understandably diverted to managing protest activity, and that's obviously a legitimate role for them. They have to be there when all of that is going on. But I think in addition, we've seen plenty of evidence that police are feeling demoralized and perhaps a bit petulant about the fact that people don't love some of their misconduct, such as the misconduct that killed George Floyd, and have been calling for a reduced scope for the police. And one of the places where I think police have pulled back from putting aside the fact that they're diverted to managing protests or that they may be out sick with COVID is traffic law enforcement, because it's an area that police were never particularly involved in doing much work. They always resented it. And if you've heard me speak about this before, you know, I've said that I've heard so many cops say to me, I didn't become a cop to do traffic law enforcement. And, you know, I don't like doing it. And if they'll admit it to you, they'll say that it's quota driven. They have to generate a certain number of tickets. And as far as they're concerned, they would much rather spend their time watching the blocks around police precincts that they have shut down to become parking lots for their private vehicles than to go out and do traffic law enforcement, even if there's an uptick in traffic danger. I think that the city can and should still move out of the business, move the police out of the business of traffic law enforcement for all the reasons that I've said. They don't want to do it. They're not efficient in doing it. Traffic stops become an occasion for bias and discrimination, not only against members of particular groups such as Black or brown people, but also in favor of other groups of people who may happen to have a PBA card in their wallet and get stopped. I think that it is legendary that the exercise of police officer discretion in the context of traffic stops is a source of all kinds of mischief and undesirable interactions between the police and the public. We have cameras and other types of automated enforcement that can do most of what the police do in this area. We have the ability to keep the police on call in case there is a danger. If there's someone in a car with a gun, that information can be conveyed to the police. I think that civilian traffic law enforcement is the way to go. We have pretty much pioneered it here in New York City with the largest speed camera program in North America, 750 cameras that now write 90% plus of the tickets that are issued in New York City, traffic tickets of any kind, 90% by the cameras. We now have bus lane cameras that are just going into operation. We have the numbers from those, and they are writing lots of tickets on drivers who will block buses. Side note here, cyclists should not ride in bus lanes. It's not lawful. It is slowing down an efficient form of transport, which is bus transport, and I urge people not to do it. It's also dangerous because bus drivers aren't necessarily all good and conscientious drivers. So we have a huge opportunity here, but the merits of getting police out of traffic law enforcement, I find, has been lost amongst an absolutely mindless and shrill debate going on in social media and in the newspapers, where we have one side of people who are saying defund the police. That's their hashtag, that's their message. They just think the less police, the better. They don't think there should be any police. And then on the other side, you have people who are saying, you know, that the city is going to shit, you know, that we have the same level of crime and decay that marked the New York City of the 70s and the 80s, that the shootings are up and violence is up and graffiti is up, and we need more police, not fewer, and we need to enforce the laws more stringently, not less. And all of this runs counter to the idea of defunding the police. And it's just not looking at the details of where police can play a constructive role and where generally they don't. And again, I think just like so much of the risk-taking and public opinions about managing personal COVID risk are driven not by empirical data and science, they're driven by passions and fears. I think that this debate about the police in much the same way is being driven by fear and prejudices and not by empirical data. And that if there's one opportunity we have that we really should try to realize is to have a civilian force responsible for traffic law enforcement, to have our roads engineered and designed so that they are, as transportation alternatives would say, self-policing. That is, that there is infrastructure that are truly protected bike lanes, that we, start to actually have some level of, I don't know if it's enforcement or guidance to pedestrians, runners, motor scooter operators, others who try to take away the space that cyclists have fought so hard for and won. And I think that with those two measures, we really can, save a lot of money and not pay police to do something that they don't want to be doing in the first place and have a much safer and more pleasant biking space. I'm just going to turn to some practical advice that I always give, because I know some of the people here haven't really heard me go over it before. Those of you who have been before, it's a good refresher. Here's a COVID-specific point. I find that a bandana is a far more comfortable face covering, just stick 'em up style, just fold it in half around the corners, tie it around your head. And it's really quite easy to breathe. And it meets the requirements for what the government is asking us to do in terms of covering our face. I have not seen any evidence of the relative efficacy of that versus a surgical or N95 mask, but I mean, probably it's got to be less effective, sure. But the point is, how much effective does it have to be when we already know that the risk of transmission is so low during cycling? So if you want to make others feel like you're concerned for their health and not give you the side eye, consider just that bandana, and you can always pop it down and bring it back up. A gaiter is another device. It's a little bit warmer and it's a little bit covers you more. So in the hot summer, it's less comfortable, I think, than a scarf that isn't even attached on the bottom, and that's what I'd recommend. One of the things that I see when I'm in the bike lane commuting that is so funny is that joggers go into the bike lane because they don't want to get germs from other joggers, right? So they think it's okay. If you ask them, what are you doing in the bike lane? They'll say, oh, it's a pandemic and I'm going to get exposed to other joggers. Well, the people who are doing it aren't wearing masks, right? So they don't want to get viral exposure from other joggers, but they're happy to be in the bike lane without a mask. And then what you see sometimes, there's so many joggers in the bike lane, that if one has to pass another, they'll pass them, but at a 6-foot distance in the bike lane. So this is actually a practical tip. If you see one jogger about to pass another up in front of you, they may choose to zip right out, right into the middle of your path of travel, because they're trying to avoid each other and the COVID risk, with their backs to you, absolutely unconcerned about the possibility of being struck. The club has done a lot to make cycling and longer distance trips possible, not only with their policies of limiting the number of people on a ride to make sure it doesn't turn into a group transmission situation at rest stops, etc., by making stops where there are available bathrooms known and publicized. And so I would encourage everyone to lead rides. After talking about how the leadership should go as a board member, I realized, hey, I shouldn't just be making these decisions. I should be doing something. I started leading some rides again, which is something I hadn't done since last summer, albeit I had been sick for most of the spring. But it felt great. I had a great ride last week. It was a small group of us, but I really encourage everyone who isn't already leading rides, who's listening to this, to use the resources on the website, look at the policy, it's not that onerous, and to get out there and lead rides. Club needs it. On the upside, outside dining means keep an eye on your bike. There's always the ability to keep an eye on your bike and make sure that it isn't going to be stolen while you're eating outside. So that's a plus. I mentioned this, watch out for crowding in the bike infrastructure and other places where you may bike because there's just more people out there looking for alternatives to subway and bus, and they don't know the rules. They're new users of those multi-use paths, of those interstitial spaces between the moving motor vehicles and the parked motor vehicles where bicyclists sometimes operate on the city streets. So they may do unpredictable things. Get a bell and use it. You know, here's some urban biking basics. Again, the focus on infection risk, which has been the huge focus of this talk, is a bit ironic given that the crash risk is a much more significant risk. What are the most common serious crash scenarios? Traveling alongside vehicles through intersections and splitting lanes with moving vehicles. This is where most fatal crashes occur. And the protective measures you can make is never go through an intersection abreast of a moving vehicle that has a right to make a legal turn across your path. It doesn't matter whether or not the vehicle is signaling. We all know cars don't signal. The signaling, I think, has gotten worse since the pandemic because everyone knows there's no law enforcement. There's never an excuse for going through an intersection aside a moving vehicle where there's a legal turn for that vehicle to make. Just don't do it. I mean, if you're riding in a group, I suppose if it's a big enough group, it's impossible to rule out. But in those cases, you're going to be much more visible, so it seems unlikely that it's going to present a problem. As a general matter, group cycling is far safer than cycling as an individual. You have a heightened visibility, and it's something I'd always promote on safety grounds and others. Lane splitting is just mid-block, riding along in the same lane as a motorist. You can do it at very low speeds. Sometimes in stop and go traffic, you just want to get up to the front for the next light. But you know, if you are forced by some unexpected development, such as a car pulling in front of you from the other lane or from the curbside lane, as we heard when Peter Flax talked about the case of Robin Heitman, you know, she just faced that perfect storm. She was riding along in her own lane, and then a cab that was at the curbside lane stopped there, just left off a passenger, pulled into her path from her right. And at that very same time, as she started to correct and move to her left, a big box truck that was on her left that she was splitting a lane with began moving into, she wasn't splitting a lane with it actually. She was technically splitting the curbside lane with the cab, but she was just sandwiched in between. So that's a space, a pickle you want to avoid getting into. Now, riding in the door zone is another common crash scenario. It's the most common scenario, although it doesn't tend to lead to fatal results. It can happen, but usually it's less serious injuries to fingers, clavicles, things of that nature. Just don't ride in the door zone. If you're in a door zone bike lane, as I call it, one of those painted lanes that's right next to a curbside parking lane, ride on the outer edge of it. You're still more protected and more visible in a bike lane, so don't avoid that altogether. Don't like ride on the opposite side of the street. Ride in it, but ride right on that outer line that separates it from the vehicular traffic. Take the lane whenever you feel the need to do so. And you can do some other things like I do, such as have a bell and ring it whenever you are traveling in the dooring zone. Just constantly, all the way through when you're in the dooring zone. And, you know, at the very least, you know, of course, I'm thinking about this as a lawyer who does this work, you can say, I was ringing my bell the whole time. Why didn't they hear me? So at least you have a good story to tell. So taking the lane, riding on the outside of a door zone biking lane and ringing your bell, looking inside cars can help, can play some role. and just keep it down. If you're in the door zone, I would not ride faster than 8 or 10 miles an hour at the very most. Anything faster, if you get doored, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get a serious injury. And then the last thing is just riding too close to others on bike or on foot. You know, that goes for pacelining with strangers. And with all the influx of people who are coming into the bike lanes, really just know who's around you at all times if someone has entered into your space. I'm always looking behind my back. I'm not assuming that I know or can hear who's behind me, who's on either side of me, who's in front of me. Your head should be moving at all times when you're in an urban environment. Out in a more rural or ex-urban road cycling scenario, you don't have to do that. But in the city, you do. Bike infrastructure, each type has its uses and limitations. I mean, the park loops and greenways are very crowded. I think that when, you're at the right time of day and they're not crowded, you're on a bike superhighway when you're on the Hudson River bike path or on Kent Avenue. Or in the park, but that's 7 o'clock in the morning or even earlier, 6 o'clock in the morning. When the tourists come out, they're really, frankly, fraught with danger, and they're not a good place to get some exercise. You can use them for transportation. They're not even that good. Parking protected bike paths, in my opinion, not safe beyond 16 miles an hour. If you're going faster than that on 1st and 2nd Avenue, for example, 8th and 9th Avenue, I would recommend taking a vehicular lane. I find myself, even though I've invested hundreds or perhaps thousands of hours in bringing parking protected bike paths to New York City, in particular 1st and 2nd Avenue, and getting irritated when I see cyclists not using them, in the current conditions where there is still less traffic than there was at the height of, before COVID, there's just fewer cars, and I leave the bike lane. The bike lane is crowded with novice cyclists and people on scooters and pedestrians and all this stuff. I'll take a lane out of the vehicular lane, and I feel some comfort from the fact that cops aren't enforcing the traffic laws either anymore, that I won't get a ticket from doing so. So, make your own decisions, but that's an option that's available. Class 2 and class 3 just means paint or even just signs and sharrows. It does collect cyclists, though, on a particular route, and I think there's a benefit to using those routes because there's safety in numbers, there's heightened visibility, and there are other cyclists who can help you in case you get hit or a driver is harassing you. So bear that in mind, and if you see a cyclist who gets injured or hurt, stop if you at all can and help them. It is an important part of what makes cycling safer that we look out for each other. Bike signals keep changing the way the city is managing them. They don't put out any written guidance about it, so be really careful about the bike-shaped signals because they've changed them over the last year. And in general, don't be overly reliant on the infrastructure. There are general protective measures like keeping a lookout, communicate freely, not just looking at people to see what they're communicating to you, but a look at a person can be communicative. A look at them and then you go like this, means that you're yielding to someone. The pedestrian can go past. You don't even have to take your hands off the handlebars to wave someone through. You can do it with your head. Get a good bell. The Spur Cycle is the best bell out there. That's my plug for them. They don't give me any money. I have to pay the same $45, which is inflated for the bell they offer, but it's probably worth it because it's the best bell I know out there. SPURCYCLE. Clearest tone, best sustain, generally overlooked by thieves, never had one stolen. It's a great bell. Of course, use lights at night and anticipate the actions of others and always have an escape plan. When you're in a crash, gather information. You want to make sure you get the information of all nearby vehicles because it may be that there was a car that was double parked or parked at a so-called daylit intersection that had a striped area intended to keep vehicles away so that there were sight lines for vehicles approaching the intersection, that those vehicles in those daylit areas were blocking that design of the intersection and were in fact a cause of the collision. So you want to find all potentially responsible parties by capturing the license plate of all nearby vehicles. Take a picture of the entire scene as close as possible to where everyone was at the time when they came to rest before people start moving their vehicles out of the way. You want solid contact information for witnesses. I can't tell you, when you're in a crash, your judgment is gone, you're awash in endorphins and adrenaline. So many people have come to me and be like, well, I gave my information when I was in a crash to the witness, but they never called me. So you have to get their contact information, of course. Stay at the scene until the police come, unless you have to be removed for medical attention. Do not refuse medical attention. It will be paid for, whether you have, any medical insurance of your own. It will be covered by the driver's insurance, even in a hit and run or an uninsured driver. Your medical bills will be covered under the no-fault system. Get a report from police. If you're not at the scene, to give the report to the police. They'll tell you it didn't happen at the insurance company. And then even though the police do show up, and you have to make sure, except for reasons of leaving for medical attention, that you're there when the police come, don't expect them to do their jobs and collect information on witnesses, on license plate, on anything else. They don't collect it. And again, help those other cyclists. They don't have the state of mind to be able to follow these, but if you come up behind them and you're calm, you know what to do and you can help them. And call a lawyer. This stuff, I'm just, as usual, these things go for too long. I just want to talk a little bit about bike insurance. If you have your own motor vehicle coverage, even if you don't own a vehicle, that coverage will supplement the insurance that the driver has to compensate you for the injuries they inflict on you. It is a good idea to have your own auto insurance policy if you can afford it. And it is far more affordable if you buy a non-owner's policy where you don't own a car, because in the view of the auto insurers, you must be a very safe risk. You don't even drive that often. You don't own a car. I have $500,000 worth of non-owners supplemental auto insurance coverage that applies to me and my family members if they are ever hit as a cyclist or as a pedestrian by a car or any motor vehicle. It applies. It is supplemental to whatever coverage the driver who might harm us has. And it costs about $600 a year for me. So it's really a good investment. Another type of coverage I'll mention is personal liability coverage as a homeowner or a renter. I think that with the pandemic, we find much more crowded conditions with non-motor vehicles or motorized vehicles that aren't subject to the motor vehicle code, such as electric unicycles and electric skateboards and all of this stuff. All that crap that we're finding on greenways and in the bike lane, those people, if you are to have a collision with one of them, they might try to sue you. If you have a homeowner or renter's policy, it almost certainly has a personal liability coverage component that will appoint a lawyer for you to defend you against the claim of that person you might injure in a crowded bike lane. It will also have some liability coverage, typically at least $100,000, and it is extremely cheap. If you already have homeowners or renters insurance, take a look and see how much the personal liability coverage is. And if it's only $100,000, you can bring it up to 300 or even 500, and I'm almost guarantee that the increase in premium is going to be something on the order of like 30 or 50 bucks at the most. And of course, in a cyclist on cyclist crash in the context of a group ride, this club has a policy where everybody riding together releases each other from liability for the harm they might cause to each other, which is a policy you can agree with or disagree with, but it's certainly one you should be aware of that is in the waiver. It serves to discourage lawsuits amongst members, and that's a benefit of it. Obviously, it prevents you from recovering from a member who might have that homeowner's coverage if they cause you harm. That's the deal when you participate. And that's the end of that program on And so I'm going to jump to some of these questions that I see in the Q&A section. Someone said, wasn't sure what you meant by trip. And of course, that form of question that is so highly contextual and implicit is one that I have absolutely no idea how to answer now. I don't remember saying anything about trip, or maybe that was in the question. I meant any trip for utilitarian purposes. Did you shift from subway to bike? Maybe that was that poll question. Jim Finder asks, are you arguing in favor of cycling or arguing against masks? If the former, yay. If the latter, you're increasing my risk, even though you say it's low. You know, that, you know, you're increasing my risk, even though you say it's low. I mean, there is a point at which an increased risk is so low that there are other risks that are routinely disregarded by members of this club when riding together. For example, the risk that I might injure you by doing something stupid on my bike and knocking your wheel and sending you to the ground. You have already released me as a co-participant on that ride from any liability for doing so, even though I've got a nice fat policy that would answer for my negligence. So clearly people who bike together are willing to accept some degree of added risk. Now, you can also say that, you know, it's a different kind of risk. It's a risk of being exposed to a virus that can kill you. And you know, so really it's a risk of death that you're increasing on my part if you are arguing against masks on rides. I would just say that you really have to look at the evidence and make a decision and ask yourself whether you're magnifying the COVID risk because it's something that's invisible. It has to do with a microscopic virus. It affects people so differently that it is something that could result in death, and that you're factoring in the distinctive aspects of the COVID transmission risk in a way that kind of doesn't, you know, that kind of artificially inflates what the real risk is of a negative outcome, of real concrete negative harm. And I think it's because this is new, because we're in a pandemic, and it's just one of those things. It's just like how we're much more prepared to hop in a car than we are to hop on a plane, or at least some of us are, even though air flight is so much safer than driving, because people just think of it and they're more comfortable with it as not posing a risk. Andy Cattell asks, regarding low risk of outdoor transmission, what about the beach parties we hear about? I think I tried to address that in talking about the difference between a stationary and a moving risk scenario. And I think when you're engaged in outdoor athletic pursuits, we know of only one reported case from Italy, 2 joggers, and they're going to have much less wind, turbulence, and dispersion. Okay, so what I'm going to do, since I talked about an open and robust debate within the club, is I realized I hadn't followed it, but I just gave Jim Finder the ability to speak for himself. I mean, I think that it's the fundamental point that it does increase the risk, and how much, you know, how much is too much, and who makes those decisions for you. But I've given you a chance to try to put a finer point on it or rebut what I said in the interest of trying to have a discussion. So Jim, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, and I'm robust.
Okay, cool.
So
although we can't see you, but okay.
I think what you said was fair. I didn't understand the reason for the extended discussion about how low the COVID-19 risk was, but now I understand you're saying, get out there and ride and don't be afraid. So that's fine. I see no reason why people should not wear masks to prevent inadvertently transferring it to someone else. And that's basically all I was asking you for. I wondered what exactly your argument was going for. So that's it.
Okay, and I guess I'll ask you, since it's something that you're concerned about, what do you think if you show up on a ride with people and you have let those people know that you want people to ride with masks in order to reduce transmission risk. And one of them is me, and I'm not wearing a surgical mask, I'm wearing a bandana like I described. Does that feel comfortable to you, or are you concerned that that's not going to be sufficiently protective?
Well, it's up to the co-leaders and the club's guidelines, but I'd say it's okay.
Okay.
On our rides, we have been insisting on masks, except when eating and then when distanced apart.
Uh-huh. But when you say masks, like there has been this issue about what's a mask, what's a face covering, and generally speaking, people are using more surgical type masks on the rides that you've been on.
Yes, I think so. I think so.
Okay. Not so much like gaiters or other types.
No, I think we've seen all of them. I think we've seen all of those things.
Okay.
Steve, if I might,
Sure.
from the perspective of something I worry a lot about, which is how we look to the world. When in Rome, do as the Romans. If you are in a group, particularly with non-cyclists around the periphery or whatever, and most people are wearing masks, please wear a mask, even if it is only a bandana. We hate to stick out as the people who are potentially spreading this thing, even if we are smarter than they are.
Okay. That's certainly a fair point. So what I'm going to do now, learning how to use this, I am going to, Jim Finder is back on mute, and I'm going to Andy Cattell, and I'm going to allow Andy to talk. Andy is on mute, but if he wants to unmute himself, if he wants to follow up and let me know if I didn't address his concern about outdoor transmission, now's his chance.
I totally agree with what you said. I've felt from the beginning that the dispersion, UV exposure while riding or doing anything else outside, and also the amount of viral load that would be required to actually infect someone in general, all argue for great safety of cycling. And your point about stationary versus moving was very good. I didn't hear that in your formal presentation, so thanks for reiterating.
Okay, and then you also asked what's my opinion about the shared use path on the Cornwall Bridge. I mean, they should have made it wider. It would have been nicer and more pleasant if they had made it wider. You know, it is new, and so it is drawing a lot of people who are not necessarily mindful of the differences between how cyclists and how pedestrians would enjoy it. And there's lots of kids and all sorts of things that, you know, can present a problem. So you have to go pretty slowly on it, but I have been over it. I have gone on it. I don't think it's raises COVID issues. And I think it's fun, and it creates more opportunities for different routes that one can take, so that you don't have to cover the same scenery on the western shore of the Hudson. If you're going up to Nyack, you don't have to just come right back down that side of the Hudson. The roads are a little bit better on the western shore of the Hudson than on the east for road cycling, but I think that the ingenuity of the club historically points up a number of nice routes, and I'm sure we'll find more. Now I'm going to go to Rebecca Herskoff, who, and I clicked on allow to talk for her. She said, address the use of face coverings while riding in a group versus rural, and then a gaiter. Yeah, I think a gaiter is definitely fine. I think that the club's existing policy with respect to group rides is that we should have masks in all situations where we're likely to end up closer than 6 feet to people. And I think the practical understanding of that rule that the club has had is when you're in the city, or at least in Manhattan, that you should be wearing the mask because it's likely you're going to end up having to stop. So you stop maybe at 175th in Fort Washington because you didn't quite get to 177th on your way over the bridge. And then there's some people waiting to cross the street. I think it's a good idea to wear a mask. I think it shows respect to people, especially if we're passing through neighborhoods where we're perceived of as outsiders. to show that we respect the communities that we go through. It's kind of a restatement of what Peter said, like we don't want to be seen as the ones causing the pandemic, but you know, we can also be just objectified as a bunch of cyclists from outside the neighborhood. And if we can behave sensitively and respectfully when we're having, you know, more or less in-person contact with people stopped at a light, that's all for the better. And the virtue of a gaiter, as well as a bandana around the neck, is that it's more easily raised and lowered to adapt to the circumstances, urban versus rural. What does that stimulate? Any follow-up questions, or does it address your concern? Your
That
question?
was fine. I also wanted to know if you could repeat the name of that bell that you recommended.
Oh, it's the Spur Cycle, SPURCYCLE. And if you do some internet research, you'll see that it has been widely imitated, and that including by some reputable bike companies like Crank Brothers and some others, and that the imitations are far inferior. So, except no substitute.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay. So I see there's a lot of chat here that I haven't really looked at, and I'm wondering if people have put questions in the chat. Steve, what are you arguing about, says Jim Finder. Just in favor of cycling? Okay, so his question came out. Today's newspaper reports a study, bandanas do not provide protection. Okay. I will hope that Jim passes that newspaper report on to me, or maybe I can find it with my own search, since it's directly relevant to what I'm talking about. I don't wear the bandana just to appease other people. I wore it because I thought that it did provide some measure of protection, and you're saying it does not at all, according to a study. In fact, in your follow-up, you say it might even be worse. And then in a third follow-up, you give me a link, so I've got some reading to do. Goldie Fernandez says he likes what I had to say about lane sharing and dooring, and we should have some details so that people can remember what I said about it. You know, we do have a spoke card where we have some tips. The idea of the spoke card is that it goes right into the wheels of your bike, and after you've been hit and you're lying there on the street and everything has gone out of mind, you'll look over in your wheel and you'll see it. So here, let's see if I can bring it up to interesting the way the virtual background works. Someone is knocking. I don't know what that is. Okay. Can you read my spoke card? Or is it backwards? Is that backwards?
No, it's good. We got it.
Okay. We give these out, and we're going to be at commuter stations around the city giving them out through people who agree to do that for us, because I think there's a lot of new cyclists out on the streets and they should be exposed to this information, these basics. So you can, I don't know, take a picture of that, see if that helps. It's basic advice when in a crash or in a traffic stop. But really the main thing to do about dooring is just don't ride in the dooring zone. I am going to mute Rebecca because it seems like she's the source of the noise. Sorry to call you out like that. You know, Neil is asking, can you characterize the state of the all-powerful bike lobby and why, after all these years, NYC isn't London, Paris, or Berlin? You know, we're not all powerful. You know, we have very limited influence, and we have almost no influence left now with this mayoral administration. I have always been of the school of thought that loyalty is an important virtue. And so the politicians who I initially decided to back with my money and other support, I understand that they can't always vote in favor of my view of the issues, the cyclist view of the issues. It's extremely rare to find someone who does something 100% of the time, not because nobody's perfect even, but because they're subject to all of these different political forces. We've had the current mayor in power for 6.5 years, and I'd say for 5.5 of them, I was supportive of him and even defending him when he made some bad decisions. But I can't remember what was the straw that broke the camel's back with me. But this mayor is a real obstacle and impediment. I think that his transportation commissioner, Polly Trottenberg, who spoke to NYCC a couple of years ago, should resign, just like the mayor's health commissioner resigned, because the mayor has been such an impediment to good policy in this area. And I'm looking forward to, I'm looking past the 16-month lame duck period of the current mayor, where he's just destroyed his credibility. I mean, it might have been his presidential run that really made me feel he was just a vain ass. And we are gonna have a new mayor at the end of that, and everyone who cares about public space and cycling in the city should try to get active. You know, obviously an easy way to do it would be through Streets Pack, but there are also political clubs in your neighborhoods, and you can just use your social media and try to find the candidate who's going to match as closely as possible what I like to think is the shared vision for the city of the people on this call and the people in the club, which is a vision of the city that has safe, pleasant, accessible places to use non-motorized transport and to enjoy the street life of New York. That's what we want, and that's something that the mayor has proven completely unable to do, it seems. So I'm going to go back to Q&A. Q&A doesn't hold anything. People have switched to the chat. They feel more comfortable speaking to us there. Here's a vote of confidence for the Spur cycle. And then someone points out the relationship between a non-owned auto policy and an umbrella policy. Yes, there are people who may have an umbrella policy that is a form of supplemental or excess coverage over and above any primary coverages they have. The umbrella will pick up for them, you know, for any of their own personal liability, including if you have a leak in your apartment, let's say, and you damage the apartment of the person beneath you. So an umbrella policy, however, has an attachment point. Typically, the attachment point is not lower than $500,000. So if you are paying for an umbrella that provides supplemental coverage in the event of harm done by a motor vehicle, you are paying for coverage most likely with an attachment point at $500,000. But if you don't have primary coverage that goes up to $500,000, you're never going to be able to enjoy that coverage, that umbrella coverage that you're actually paying for. So that's a reason to get primary coverage, even if you don't own a motor vehicle, with a non-owner policy, so that you can then have seamless coverage up through that umbrella policy. And umbrellas also typically will provide personal liability coverage that picks up from wherever your homeowner or renter primary personal liability coverage leaves off. And that's something that I also do, because I like to have insurance coverage, because I am concerned about risk, even though I may be more of a libertine when it comes to COVID risk than others on the call. I'm going to leave the last word to Peter and put him on the spot. 4 minutes before we said that this was going to be over. Anything that you want to add, subtract, or modify in what was said today, or give us some thoughts going forward, Peter? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Being on mute does not help things. I thought it was an excellent presentation. Thank you, Steve. It helped immensely that I agreed with you on all of it. And I look forward to the next one. This was your
Okay.
monthly club meeting, everybody. Someday we'll get back to Connolly's, but right now, this is it.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone, and good night.
Good night.